Question 5 on the part 3, A Clearing in the Forest, asks, Thornhill's hunger for a place is strongly developed in this chapter. What steps does he take to claim the territory as own? And the best quotation, I think, is on page 160, where he is trying to show his control by controlling the land around him. So on page 160 it reads, chopping, clearing, building. He was discovering a new William Thornhill, though, a man who could labour against wilderness until it yielded up a dwelling. So that idea of he will control it until it yields, gives back to him, gives in to him and gives back to him. And he talks about this idea of building a larger corn patch, of shoring up the fireplace, of putting hinges on the door and so on. So he's really establishing himself as a landowner. And that goes along with his relationship with the local Indigenous tribe of being the authority figure, being the gentry amongst the community, telling them to go, saying he will share the rest of the place, but this here is Thornhill's place. You've got the rest of it. Question 6 asks us, the Thornhill family meet many of the neighbours in this chapter. What attitude does each of the following reveal about the Indigenous people? Now, we've spoken a little bit about it, but it's on page 162, and the neighbours arrive. Now, Smasher Sullivan, Sagady and Spider all have names starting with S, and they tend to be the ringleaders. They're usually not very clever. They're good with a story. They exaggerate stories about the Indigenous, the most graphic being the one where the Indigenous open up the body of a white woman and eat the baby. Now, they admit, one of them admits, I think this is Smasher who tells this story, admits to have not been there, but that it was a true story. Spider's quite an interesting one. He even uses the expression vermin when talking about the Indigenous on page 164. So they have a very poor attitude. Now remember, these men are ex-convicts. They have been caught stealing. They've been sent out here. Some of them have done hard time in Van Diemen's Land, and yet, despite their criminal activity, they see themselves as being above the Indigenous. Loveday appears on page 165. We also meet Mrs. Webb, and on 166 we meet Mrs. Herring. Now, she's a shrewd old soul, but she's also caring, and Sal particularly identifies with the widow Herring. Her attitude is one where she shares, she behaves in a way that is conciliatory. She understands that there will be a sense of give and take, much like the lesson we learn from Blackwood a bit later. Now you can read those pages from 164 and it finishes around 169. On pages 168 to 169, Blackwood gives some important advice. He told Thornhill this earlier on when he first saw Thornhill Point, but it is reiterated on 169. He says, you got to work it out your own way. So we all have our own relationships with the Indigenous. But when you take a little, bear in mind you've got to give a little. And he repeats it, give a little, take a little. And Thornhill wonders, is it a warning or a threat? Or is it important advice? But Blackwood won't explain himself. But the significance of the advice is that if you don't adhere to it, you will pay the consequences. And that certainly happens to some of the neighbours who are retaliatory and violent. And so when the Indigenous give some of their land but suffer for it, they will take in return. The next question asks about the two servants that are acquired. In this arrangement, the reader sees the clash of values around social class in the new colony, and what do we learn? Now, significantly, when Will goes to get these two servants, he runs into, on page 172, Suckling. Suckling says to him, with his neat little smile, "I never forget a felon's face. William Thornhill, Alexander Transport." And on 173, Will realises when Suckling snorts and flinches at the sight of him and tells him to stand back, man, that those old ideas of hierarchy have followed them from England. He shooed Thornhill away with both hands as if he were a dog. "Stand back, for God's sakes, man," he shouted. "You harbour the flies so." So those ideas of authority that belong to money, position, and the gentry have now found a home amongst the less gentrified Suckling. And it is the same sorts of behaviours that Thornhill we see him exploit with the Indigenous. He says here, interestingly, "In an instant the glories of Port Jackson became a prison once more. The sunlight lost its colour. The closed-in township became a poisonous place where a man might choke to death." And this certainly starts to confirm for him that his promise to Sal will be impossible to keep. On page 175, he meets Dan Oldfield. Now, Dan Oldfield he knew as a young man back in London, and he knew Rob as well. Now, Will Thornhill establishes straight up his authority. He actually lords over Dan Oldfield. And he says, "Forgetting your manners, are you, Dan Oldfield?" he said, and saw the grin close down. He thought of the way Suckling smiled, not showing any teeth, and tried it himself. "It is Mr. Thornhill, Dan," he said. "You would do well to remember." And it feels quite good. He'll actually say it feels quite good, and Sal certainly will reflect that same feeling of having power over a man. If you go to the bottom of 175, it says, "He knew what it was like to be Dan. That was the trouble. He might be entitled to stand in power over him, but in the eyes of men like Suckling, he and Dan Oldfield were the same. He saw what he had never seen before, that there could be no future for the Thornhills back in London." That certainly sends Sal's dreams behind. He reinforces this on page 176. What was worse, he saw in that same airless moment that the children of a man with the taint, that means children of convicts, would be tainted too. So would his children's and his children's children. Their very name Thornhill would carry the taint. He pictured them, a row of pink faces in white lace bonnets, the sons and daughters of his children, floating off into the distance in their cots, but blighted a shadow over their faces. Now he understood, as he had not before, why Blackwood's mouth had always grown soft when he pointed his boat up the river and coiled his way deep into the land. The Hawkesbury was the one place where no man could set himself up as better than his neighbour. They were all emancipists in the private valley. There, and only there, a man did not have to drag his stinking past around behind him like a dead dog. I think that's a useful quotation. You might want to reflect on that as one of the children. Dan is returns with him to Thornhill Point, and on 176 and 177, we get an idea of how it feels to lord it over Ned and Dan. At the top of 177, it says, "He thought of the pleasure they had both taken in playing the game of master and servant. In the early days in Sydney, this business with Dan was another kind of pleasure altogether, and no game. The reality was that they had power almost of life and death over Dan Oldfield, and something in them both was enjoying it. His own pleasure in it, as he had bullied Dan on the wharf, had come as a surprise to Thornhill. He had not known that he had it in him to be a tyrant. Now that's lovely foreshadowing for later on in the text when he goes along. He's part of the leader of the massacre. 178, we realize that Dan understands his relative position and how he will be fundamentally lower than Thornhill unless he rises up the ranks as well. There is a moment on page 180 where Thornhill realizes that a man begging for his life was actually quite ugly and quite easy to refuse. And don't forget, the children are all watching this. It says, he realized now how begging made a man ugly and hardly human, easy to refuse. They continue to work the land. Sal becomes quite unwell. And he, by 183, so this is question 9, he hates himself for bringing her here. But what he realizes in her grave illness is that she still dreams of home. He realizes home is impossible for them, but she wants to be facing north when she's buried on page 184, where home is. And that's what he learns in her illness. He hates himself. He feels he can't live without her, but he also realizes the depth of her commitment. When she's well again, at the end of this section, her first question is whether they have kept the marks on the tree going while she has been unwell. So we learn that the Thornhills have very different ambitions, and there's quite a secret kept by Thornhill from Sal about his ambition, and that Sal has remained committed to his promise, which will certainly put him under pressure later in the novel.